Hear me all right? Close. Okay. No?
Oh,
He's
no.
not very close.
Oh my God.
I know it's horrible. I'm sorry.
Rock star or something. Okay, yeah, so I'm really sorry you can not read anything there, but this is just an introductory slide for, with, it's chock full of information about who this person was. I'll just give you the highlights. He was a poet, basically. He was also, he was a prolific, absolutely prolific writer. I think 33 volumes of his writing in Bengali have come out, and then there's also stuff that he did in English and so on. Anyway, so what's important about him for our purposes is that he was a member of an eminent family, a Bengali family from Kolkata, what is now Kolkata, undivided Bengal, etc., who were a bunch of, at the head of a religious and social reform movement. And they, well, they're known for having opposed idol worship and predominance of ritual observances, worship in mainstream Hindu religiosity. Okay. But they also identified themselves, they are known as the Brahmo Samaj, you've probably heard of them. They identified themselves as variously as monists, monotheists, Vedantins, Advaitins. Yeah?
Yeah, just.
Oh, my goodness. Okay. Can you hear me still?
Yes.
Okay. Fine. So that's what all of this says, and I'm just going to move forward so you can see what it is that I'm talking about. I've written all over my slides. I'm sorry. So my talk is about a poet's understanding of the Upanishadic ideal of Brahman and of the relationship of God with individual human subjects. Now, I should immediately say that I feel like I'm violating some kind of a norm of adhikara. I have no business talking about a poet. I'm really focusing more on the God, out of the God and consciousness options that are here. Anyway, having said that, so my paper is based on some prose writings that Tagore did to explain basically the Upanishads to himself, as well as to anyone who cared to listen. Now, unfortunately, some of the Bengali texts that I have consulted for this paper was delivered as sermons to the kids in a school that he founded in 1901. And these kids prefer to pelt each other with pebbles rather than listen to a middle-aged man talk about the Upanishads. Right? That's to be expected. So it's a matter of some debate whether he was a philosopher or at least a man of vision. He has been compared by at least one commentator to Hölderlin, a similar kind of, spiritual person and a poet at that. So he usually denied being a philosopher, but he was often treated as one. So to cut a long story short, he seemed to discerning people to have philosophical insights. So for the purposes of my talk, I'm just going to treat him as a philosopher until such time as we see him throw off the yoke of that epithet. Because somewhere along the way, some philosophical question has to be abandoned for the lack of a rational answer. And we'll see how that works out, hopefully. Okay. So the task that I've undertaken in this paper is to tell a story about Tagore's view of Brahman around the years 1908 to 1917, and to compare his understanding to a set of concepts in the Bhagavad Gita. Now, he was required by his religion the Brahmo religion to study the Upanishads, Swadhyaya, as they rightly called it, or at least the Brahmo liturgical texts that were drawn from them. And that's the name of the text up there, Brahma Dharma. However, the Gita is a Vaishnava text, right? And as a rule, Brahmins are not keen to associate themselves with any faith, scripture, or practice that they deem idolatrous. But then again, the Gita transcends sectarian associations. We find Tagore thinking about the Gita, often offering the occasional terse commentary and using imagery or metaphor lifted directly from the Gita. A very memorable example for those of you who do read Bengali is that of the solitary peasant reaper, as it so happens, working his very isolated field in the poem Shonakuri. It's a very well-known, one of his very good poems. So this study assumes that it is worth asking whether Tagore in his middle years entertained a definite theological or perhaps ontotheological view, whereby ontotheology, I mean a mixed theory that both accounts for the constituent nature of all existing things, ontology, as well as the cause of their existence, theology, that's it. I think he did, in part because of his Brahmo lineage. On the other hand, Tagore does not distinguish the faith of the Brahmins from that of what he calls the Hindu Samaj, presumably because he took the philosophy of Brahmanism to be the essence of the latter faith. On the other hand, there is a sense in which he took himself to have transcended the sectarian Sampradayika boundaries of Brahmanism by midlife. Citing the essay Amar Dharma, that's Ramanuja Mukhopadhyay, I've talked about him right there. This is the title that Tagore himself would have probably translated as My Religion, along the lines of, the religion of man or a poet's religion. So Ramanuja Mukhopadhyay points out that Tagore thought of each individual as having a dharma specific to herself, identical with the specific form of the truth, satya, in her. This dharma is distinct from the overt dharma of creed and sect, since it covertly shapes the individual from within. Mukhopadhyay quotes from a letter in which Tagore asserts that he no longer shared certain opinions or feelings with the members of the Adi Brahmo Samaj. And this was at a time when he was actually leading the Samaj at his father's insistence. And that he was now outside all Samajas, as he says. In the remark that I just quoted at you, one finds resonances of both the notion of Swadharma in the Bhagavad Gita and Tagore's own view of continuous self-transcendence, the covert shaping of the self alluded to. In his 1930 Hibbert Lectures, published as The Religion of Man, the latter idea is worked out in terms of an in-principle, endless quest for perfection along multiple dimensions. In the passage quoted by Mukhopadhyay in his book, one also gets a whiff of Tagore's notion of a Jivan Devata, literally life deity. We will not have occasion to discuss most of these aspects of Tagore's thought today. Tagore's understanding of his relationship to Brahmanism has been foregrounded thus far, so that we may better understand the notion of divinity that will be explored in this essay. So that's my first proper section, the Ishopanishad and the world of personality, which is the name of the title of an essay. It's a quick short section. Tagore's reading of the Ishopanishad engages the idea of a transcendent being that is both the ground of all that exists, yet pervades everything as both sole principle and aspect of consciousness. The Upanishad presents us with a paradox, well known to possibly everyone in this room, in the dual notion that the transcendent ground of all being, subjective and objective, Brahman, though the term is not used in this Upanishad, Upanishad, I don't think, cannot cross down over into the realm of plurality of being. While as unitary consciousness pervading the world of beings, it cannot be transcendent. So the immanent cannot be transcendent and vice versa. In a 1917 essay titled The World of Personality, Tagore reads the paradox in a way that makes sense of its constituent moving parts and tries to resolve it through the notion of personality as that which integrates those moving parts. By personality, Tagore meant the outward expression of a self in which are integrated a variety of modes of being and self-expression. It is his term for the manifested personhood of an individual. Tagore thinks of each personality as the center of her world, with the latter being a projection and a synthesis of the deliverances of her cognitive and affective capacities. An individual's world is pervaded by her personality in the sense that her beliefs, actions, feelings, creations, plans, undertakings, adventures, and so on modify the world in unique ways. There's an analogy with God here, clearly. In Tagore's view, individual personalities reflect and are illuminated by a central personality that grounds an ordered universe. You might think of, subjective idealism, something like that. Although I will not try to attribute, classical philosophical positions to Tagore because they don't really stick. The latter idea is expounded in the Ishopanishad, with its opening verse dictating the fundamental human dharma. All the world is pervaded by Isha and so forth. In a Bengali essay written in the winter of 1908, in this remarkable work called Shantiniketan, Tagore already appears to have had the notion of an integrative truth within which all partial truths come to be in harmony, samanjasya, in which all discrete phenomena are united, sammilita. His allusion there was to a different Upanishadic text, though one that is not inconsistent with the account of Isha, translated sovereign or lord in the Ishopanishad. He had described what is in effect an integrative Saguna Brahman as having love as its own form or nature. Own form is a term that Chakravarti Ramprasad uses. I just borrowed it from him. Isha then is Prema Swarupa. This, he had argued, serves to make all phenomena of separation and conflict only partially true, from what we might call the perspective of eternity. So from the perspective of eternity, there is no conflict. And in various songs and poems, he goes on to say more difficult to understand things like there is no death either, there is no separation, there is no pain, and so forth. So this is my second section, God as person. So first I'll say a few things about his notion of God as truth and power. The subjectivity of this integrative central person is then thought to be understood in comparison with our own limited perspective on the world. It is a fact, we might say, that the stars are truly still relative to us, this being the layperson's observation-based view on the matter. But they're also truly moving from the point of view of the scientist who uses sophisticated instruments to enhance, corroborate, and ultimately counter visual data. We lack sufficient reason to take the scientist's judgment as correct over that of the laypersons, according to Tagore, since the former two, the scientist's view, is bound to a limited perspective on the phenomenon in question. Tagore argues that when we prefer one limited perspective on a phenomenon over another, we lose sight of the whole truth. For after all, the exaggerated largeness of a microscopic image of human red blood cells is no more real than the actual item, namely blood trickling down your cheek or whatever. Similar things could be said about our experience of events in time, depending on the state of our mind. We experience the passage of time as relatively slower or faster. It doesn't make good sense to prefer one judgment of temporal experience over another as correctly representing reality, temporal reality. The central point of view that is privy to all truth and grounds all the worlds projected by limited subjectivities belongs to Saguna Brahman. It belongs to Ishvara. By the term world in this instance, Tagore means a complex product of mental construction, or as he calls it, a creation. In general, it is a mistake to think of the mind as a mirror to a world of facts. The mind is the principal element of creation of our worlds in time and space. Tagore makes the vaguely Humean assertion that the methods of our moral training have been based upon the fact that by changing our mental focus, our perspective, the whole world is changed and becomes, in certain respects, a different creation with things of changed value. Now, something about aesthetics, inevitably, because Tagore is an artist. So good poets compose lines of verse, making use of extraordinary shifts of perspective and willful bending of the grammar of their medium. And Tagore gives an example from Walt Whitman, I contain multitudes, that poem. Tagore asserts, when the mind of a person like Walt Whitman moves in a time different from others, his world does not necessarily come to ruin through dislocation, because there in the center of his world dwells his own personality. So the personality, if you like, is something that supports and upholds that world which it projects. We note that the ability of a Whitman or a Shelley to support and execute novel syntheses of forms illuminates their Shakti, or latent power that finds expression in their creations. We'll presently see that these remarks on artistic self-expression serve to set up a series of analogies for divine creativity. One last thing, it was kind of an afterthought. The creation of art implicates absolute freedom, as does God's creation emanation. So a few proof texts at this point. I won't read all of them, but hopefully I can get through most of them. Tagore offers, first of all, a gloss of Ishopanishad 4 and 5. There is a point where in the mystery of existence, contradictions meet, where movement is not all movement and stillness is not all stillness, where the idea and the form, the within and the without are united, where infinite becomes finite without losing its infinity. It's almost a pada by pada translation of the thing. If this meeting is dissolved, then things become unreal. Notice that this is a description of an unlimited capacity for integration or harmonization, because it belongs to God, to God's personality. One can speak of it via negativa, though that is not the same as speaking meaningfully. As far as creating this world is concerned, God is not hamstrung by a limitation of perspective, but his expression is necessarily conditioned by the absence of an avenue for infinite expression. This world is limited, right? God is infinite. What's he going to do? Well, therefore, infinite God expresses himself in the universe as a never-ending series of becomings. Yes, second one here. The medium of finitude represents God's self-imposed limitations, the law of space and time, of form and movement. This law is reason, which is universal. Reason which guides the endless rhythm of the creative idea, perpetually manifesting itself in its ever-changing forms. This is the sense in which the law of the universe is inviolable, the sense in which, as the Taittiriya Upanishad says, the elements of the heavenly bodies unfailingly perform their respective functions. They stay in their place and so on. We note that on this view, yes, and Tagore also actually helps himself to a distinction made in the Vajasaneyi Samhita between Vidhata and Bandhu. Right, so the Vidhata makes the heavenly bodies stay in their place and perform their functions, whereas as Bandhu, he makes himself available to the devotee, right? And this is an arrangement that sort of defangs any potential objections concerning limits to God's powers. We note also that on this view, God deploys infinite pre-existing material, which is himself, by the way, there being no other material. he's the only material there is, right? Deploys infinite pre-existing material, that is to say his own being, to engage this process of continuous expression / emanation in an infinity of ways. The alternative option of creation ex nihilo was rejected across Indian theologies, and for this insight, I depend on Chakravarti Ramprasad and Gavin Pillai. How much time do I have? 10 minutes. Okay. I'll rush through some of this, I'm sorry. Tagore takes some liberties with Ishopanishad 9 and 11, rendering avidya and vidya in those texts as knowledge of the finite and knowledge pursuit of the infinite. Vidya is knowledge / pursuit of the infinite, whereas avidya is knowledge of the finite. His translation of Ishopanishad verse 11 reads, he who also knows that the knowledge of he who knows that the knowledge of the finite and the infinite is combined in one, crosses death by the help of the knowledge of the finite and achieves immortality by the help of the knowledge of the infinite. He offers the following commentary, which is up there for you. I'll just read one part of it. The infinite and the finite are one as song and singing are one. The singing is incomplete. By a continual process of death, it gives up the song which is complete. The absolute infinite is like a music which is devoid of all definite tunes and therefore meaningless. Now, there is a Vishishtadvaitic flavor to Tagore's conception of Isha in some of these lines such as these. His world lends meaning and form to his personality by Ishvara's world lends meaning and form to his personality, for without these, we could not possibly seek to know it from within an emanated universe. Its forms are real. It is only when we throw appearances, as Tagore says, into the crucible of reason that they completely disappear, leading us to think that they were illusory, that is, mere Maya to begin with. The idea which is infinite cannot be expressed in forms which are absolutely finite, therefore forms must always move and change. They must necessarily die to reveal the deathless. The expression as expression must be definite, which can only be in its form, but at the same time as the expression of the infinite, it must be indefinite, which can only be in its. Again, this is a gloss of the fourth verse of the Ishopanishad. I completely omitted the most important part, really. When the world takes its shape, it always transcends its shape. This is a typically Tagorean idea. It carelessly runs out of itself to say that its meaning is more than what it can contain. Finally, the joy that we take in the world of appearances is anything but anything but unreal. While commenting on the relationship between Prakasha and Ananda, the two so-called characteristics of Brahman, Tagore remarks that it is the sudden eruption of joy in our stream of consciousness that fully illuminates the reality of the joy-inducing appearances. Now, this can't be a philosophical position because I can experience a lot of joy from taking drugs, for instance, right? So this is not a philosophical position. This is rather a subjective feeling. Has given voice to a subjective feeling, a vision, although substantive one, based on the analogy with the reality of those that we love best in our lives. So if we love somebody, then they are more real to us than somebody for whom we have no feelings at all. One gets the sense that after he had run through every rational way to make sense of the Upanishadic claims, Tagore came to rely upon interpretations of his affective experiences to engage deeper with the object of his faith, with Ishwar. Closer to the end of the essay, Tagore gives a rather opportunistic reading of the Ishopanishad, the first verse of the Ishopanishad, which is, know that all that moves in this moving world is held by the infinity of God and enjoyed by that which he abandons. He translated this verse about 50 times in his career, and he did it differently almost every The idea is that which I enjoy in the world is also God's stuff. Since God pervades the whole emanation, therefore the God of my enjoyment is not a static, impersonal God, but a divine person who produces a world of forms to be enjoyed by subjects such as myself. He's slowly working his way towards divine love. Finally, Tagore draws some injunctions from his reading of the Upanishad. From this, we find our ideal, perpetual giving up is the truth of life, because God gives up all the time. The perfection of this is our life's perfection. We are to make this life our own in all its expressions. It must be fully suggestive of our soul, which is infinite, not merely of our possessions, which have no meaning in themselves. The consciousness of the infinite in us proves itself by our joy in giving ourselves out of our abundance. And then our work is the process of our renunciation. It is one with our life. It is like the flowing of the river, which is the river itself. Giving up or giving out of one's abundance or God's is construed by Tagore as a gift from God to human subjects, or the other way around, or from one human subject to another. A necessary condition of giving is that it is not required or determined by circumstance. It fulfills no need or prayojana that an agent might have. Compare the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 3, verse 22, translated by Flavin Martin in the following way: O son of Pritha, there is naught that I need do in the three worlds, nor anything that I might attain, and yet I take part in action. So no prayojana, yet God acts. As is well known, a central theme of the Bhagavad Gita is to sanctify work by giving up or sacrificing its fruits. Given the impact of this view upon the Indian mind, it is certain that Tagore's view of renunciation was influenced by it. According to him, renunciation presupposes love, while love is impossible without renunciation of the needs of one's ego. Thus, the sanctification of routine acts of renunciation must necessarily have an agapic component. My final substantial section. Doing my best to comport it. Tagore's Svadhyaya of Advaita, I am just going to say this. So armed with the assumption that Tagore's view of the divine creative personality makes for a good fit with the transcendent yet immanent Brahman of Upanishads, such as the Ishopanishad and the Shvetashvatara, which also I discuss in my paper, which I'm not including in this talk. Let us finally compare his view to the Bhagavad Gita view of the Purushottam. Bhagavad Gita 15, verses 16 to 20, talks about three Purushas described as perishable Kshara, imperishable Akshara Purusha, and finally the highest Purusha, Purushottama, also known as the highest self, Paramatman, which is basically Krishna sustaining the world. What is disconcerting about this triad, to me anyhow, is that its highest member is presumably a god that fully pervades his creation rather than some Ur Nirguna Brahman. In his laconic commentary on the Gita, Sri Krishna Prem speaks of his account of the Purusha triad in the Bhagavad and the Pancharatra tradition, where it is called the teaching concerning the Trisauparna, the three birds, rather than the better known two of the Mundaka Upanishad. He describes Krishna as maintaining the ultimate divine poise in the hierarchical structure, with the result that the two aspects of being, the changing and the changeless, are held together in one firm embrace, and that the former is redeemed from being what to some teachings it seemed inevitably to be a ghastly mistake, which should not have occurred, and which to some all-refined mystic logic never has occurred. Just 1 minute now, I think. In other words, the monotheism of the Bhagavad Gita is firmly underlined in this part of the text, with the mechanism by which the Saguna Nirguna Brahman of the Upanishads is immanent in the world while being at the same time transcendent. It is a formula that explains the sovereignty of Isha while not relinquishing any part of Brahman's epistemic non-accessibility. This is not to say that it resolves all conceptual difficulties, the alignment of the non-dualism with the panentheism and what Angelica Malinar calls the cosmological monotheism of the Bhagavad Gita, serious scholarly epithet to describe the style of monotheism in which a highest God that pervades the world retains its supremacy because it abides alongside a host of smaller gods with a variety of functions. Tagore would remind us that the only thing that can substitute for logic in dissolving the radical opposition of the qualitied and qualityless, Saguna versus Nirguna, Brahman, is the paradoxical concept of God's love. God pervades the world by continually giving up his infinitude, and he gives himself, that is to say, fills the world with all aspectual limited truths that are synthesized in his person in order to gain in full the love of such limited beings as ourselves. We would fully know this divine person only by giving ourselves, which is to say our involvement with our own self-interest as fully to him. In conclusion, I think that with all the proof texts that I have produced, Tagore's strategy has been to do an elegant bit of ground clearing around all conceptual riddles before ultimately letting them be. He makes an argument for an affective relationship with God or Purushottam in order to know Brahman. Finally, it is interesting to see Tagore make sense of classic accounts of divine love that have God needing the love of human devotees in a surprising inversion of transcendence. Chakravarti Ramprasad gives a learned explanation of this divine self-abnegation in Ramanuja's theology in terms of a rhizomatic account of divine accessibility. So there's no real hierarchy between God and us when it comes to our relationship in love. Tagore lines the last thing, using tools no sharper than a tightly consistent reading of the Upanishadic texts and an unusual amount of poetical empathy. Yeah, that's all I thought. Thank you.